Okay, so we're in the middle. Excuse my squeaky chair. We're in the middle of a square between Mercury and Neptune. Now, the planet Neptune, if you look at Groff's system of perinatal matrices, which describe stages of the birth process, Neptune is associated with the kind of the beginning stage of the infant in the womb of this kind of primordial state of non-separation, of like just being the, you know, in there, attached with the mother, having no kind of sense of self, or it's just sort of this sort of warm, undifferentiated, fuzzy kind of thing. And it's also associated with oceanic bliss. Um, but so that you get this impression of Neptune of being, it's kind of like the Garden of Eden, or this sort of primordial paradise. It could be this like vision of fantasy, but it's also something that isn't really clearly defined, so it can be a bit fuzzy and prone to basically illusions and distortions and that kind of thing. The that kind of idea of the infant in the womb, kind of, it, you might get the sense where like the boundary between mother and child is not fully formed. It's not really formed itself as a separate entity that can walk and talk and think for itself. It's still like in that stage where it's kind of like, it's, well, I mean, if you look at topics like abortion, it's up for people to debate the whole thing of it. Is it even a separate being? Does it have a life of its own? When do you consider something, when you're born, you cut the umbilical cord? These are kind of things where Neptune is that kind of that fuzzy boundary line where the lines are kind of blurred and things haven't really taken form yet. There's also this principle of Neptune having to do with unity, right? Of it being like, we're all one, no differences between self and other, and maybe like this kind of like utopian idea of like, let's all just get along, and world peace, and erase the differences, and that kind of thing. Um, so if you compare when it's in a square with Mercury in Gemini, one of the things that kind of marks Gemini as having a different quality from Pisces is that Gemini, being an air sign, it has more to do with differentiating things. It's about kind of the multiplicity of like multiple opinions, multiple options, multiple things splitting off into different varied forms, and being kind of dazzled by like the kid in the candy store, like all the different things that are out there, whereas Neptune kind of sees it kind of like all as just kind of one thing. And there's one thing that I've kind of noticed in this dynamic is this idea of the Neptune ideal is to sort of like go beyond the boundaries, go beyond the differences, and it's like it might have this effect maybe of like minimizing or trying to just say like, like we've been, mankind, humanity, we've been through all these wars and conflicts, and just because we can't get, we we do someone, it's like tomato, that's what I was thinking. Like it's like, like people will go to war and kill each other, and it's really over differences that don't mean anything, so let's just hold hands and sing a tra la la, and it's all good and stuff like that. And that if you're, other thing too is that like if you're playing this if people who insist that there are real differences, or that like if you're just hung up on what makes me different from you, you just need to get over it, and it come together basically, right? But there's something too about this, which is a you got to watch out, because Mercury can be a bit of a trickster, right? And it's important to sort of have some discernment and some judgment, because I think that like with Neptune, there's always room for kind of deception, or that kind of like having the wool pulled over your eyes and not really seeing the truth, and just being like, I just accept everything, so I accept, what you're telling me is true, in a kind of like naive, innocent way, because it's kind of like this kind of undifferentiated Neptune, before you've come out of before you've fallen from the Garden of Eden, basically. Because that's, if you look at the story of Adam and Eve, essentially, eating the fruit from the apple is becoming aware of the first separation, right? The what is unified now becomes opposite, and gives birth to the 10,000 things, right? And into the world of form and matter and all the different stuff going on. Whereas I think like Neptune is kind of like this ideal of like the golden, back to the garden before they ate the apple, and before everything, the fall, and before everything became corrupt, right? There's an interesting dynamic going on with Neptune when you consider this idea of corruption. I often associate corruption with Pluto, but there's something about Neptune. It has to do with the sense of porousness. Like I noticed, I took a class from Achuda, and I just watched Achuda's video on this stuff, and to be honest, oh man, like I've got a ways to go, because it's a good point that he made about the restraining yourself from saying something, like holding back from acting something out. And I don't know, I feel like I just kind of like, I was at a point where the stresses were getting from me, and I wasn't at my best for having that kind of restraint, and maybe I said some things I shouldn't have. But like maybe it's, I don't know. My intention with these videos, though, right now I don't really want to get too much in my own personal life. I want to keep it about the astrology, because for the sake of, maybe if people are watching this, they're here for what I would have to say about the astrology, and they don't want me, giving them my personal diary entry on here or something like that. So I want to keep this kind of pure, but use the astrology so I can kind of reflect on how this is being informed by my own life, right? But there's something about this thing about being kind of porous to what's in the environment, and that's this basic Neptune theme about how there isn't a clearly defined boundary between self and other. If anything, Saturn represents Saturn's like the wall, right? And I think you can illustrate this really well. If you look at what happened around the time of the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, that came off the heels of a Saturn-Neptune conjunction. So it's like a really literal way to see that as like the wall being dissolved, the wall being broken down. And so with this kind of dissolving kind of, it's like, it's not like having a big protected, walled up kind of bubble that separates you from everybody else. It's more like subtle things in the environment can kind of get in, and to be careful about what environments you're putting yourself into, or being aware that might even unconsciously affect the kinds of choices that you're making, or how you're, I don't know. There could be subtle influences, basically, and under these transits that are really acute, like a square between Mercury and Neptune, you could be really picking up these really subtle things, and being influenced by them. There's there's something. I feel a bit funny about this, because it goes with the transit, though, because Mercury, if anything, Mercury's a bit of a thief, right? That one of the first things Mercury did when he was born was steal a cow. And so there's this kind of thing with ideas, concepts, stories, or whatever. It's like we're always borrowing stuff from other people. And there's this, so you want to present like your original, and you just came up with the stuff yourself. And for me, it's like a challenge because I like watching certain people's videos. And I don't want to steal from them. This isn't from somebody else's video. This isn't from somebody else that I know is a professional astrologer, but this is from a friend of mine who I had a chat with about Neptune, and she made a really good analogy with Lord of the Rings, basically, and that she was saying that Frodo was especially a Neptunian character, because if you think about the ring, right, because the ring has this corrupting influence on whoever carries it, and they chose Frodo to carry it because he is a sort of this innocent character who is pure of heart, who could actually carry it all the way to Mount Doom without being corrupted by it. Like there's all these things like, Boromir turns against him and tries to take it and all this kind of stuff in the first book or whatever. At the very end of Lord of the Rings, though, Frodo like right when he's on the verge of gonna throw it in, it's like he actually takes it for himself, and then Gollum comes and bites his finger off, right? So even he at the very end of it, sort of is like that kind of porousness, right? Like he kind of succumbs to that influence. And there's all this other stuff like leading up to that. He gets bitten by the spider and he gets poisoned. So this is one thing, like Neptune's often associated with things like drugs and alcohol, intoxication. It's not, and this is like it's not just because there's like people looking for this kind of unified state where they want to like have that comfort, going back to the bond of feeling like you're in the womb or something like that. So you're just gonna drink yourself into it, or you're gonna take all these drugs to feel this like blissed out kind of oceanic bliss because you're tripping out or whatever. I mean, this is why Neptune gets associated with substance use, but there's also a part of Neptune which is kind of like, it's sort of like porous and permeable, and it's like when you're in certain environments where you start to be sort of subject to the influences in those environments, and you've got to be sort of you got to be careful about what you're taking in. And I think that the flip side of that is also this thing about purification, right? Because it's like, because you're more sensitive, because you're more porous to whatever is going on in the environment or whatever you're taking in that's affecting you, there's this sort of like need to sort of like eliminate that which is having a not so great of an influence. And then that turns into this other thing, which is a shadow side of Neptune, was when purification turns really nasty, and then you've got things like genocides and holocausts, all in the name of trying to purify, get rid of, scapegoat certain things and wipe them out for the sake of certain things. I mean, even I can't really believe I said that. It's like objectifying language, but you're like you're objectifying people, or you're trying to. Trying to eliminate the foreign influence, basically, or to create a kind of like a pure, uncorrupted thing by like casting out the negativity or something like that. But then it becomes there's the outer planets tend to be even more psychedelic, because there's often this thing where it's like where you're it becomes this kind of a mirroring thing where the stuff that you're reacting against, it's sort of like you're really just reacting to yourself, and it's like by the more you're engaging in this sort of, you're trying to like purify, but then it's like the thing that's trying to purify is actually the thing that's corrupt. Like if you look at the Nazis, right? I mean, it was like, if anything, you'd probably want to purify out the Adolf Hitler in you, not not the Jew or the Gypsy in you, because now it's like, I don't know if this is a good example or not. I'm trying to do my best with it though, but So to bring it back to this Frodo stuff, if anything, what Frodo represented was the kind of uncorruptible innocence. Even though, I mean, eventually even Frodo, I guess, does have to get his finger bitten off in order to throw the ring into Mount Doom. He does sort of like kind of fall prey to, but such a kind of a pure innocent thing that he was able to be the ring bearer. And this idea of what is purification but an attempt to sort of like harken back to this prior state of innocence, to try to like go back to the golden age before the fall, before everything went wrong. That's kind of what purification is trying to do, is to try to get back the sort of idealism that's sort of the fantasy vision of Neptune. Like Neptune represents the fantasy of what things could be like once we're purified. And also, but then also the toxicity, there's the dissolving, right? The boundary dissolution is also like the whole. If you talk about that thing about genocide, that was almost an example of it, because there's something about it which is like, it's almost like an acidic dissolving of all the stuff that we don't think is pure, as if like you're taking like, really heavy duty corrosive cleaner to really scrub the grime off. It's like Neptune's got that corrosive. It's like it may be suitable for the psychedelic boundary dissolving thing, because like Neptune, if anything, is probably like acid, right? It's like that acid that will scrub away, eat away, dissolve, and that maybe we have a positive association with that if we like the boundary dissolving psychedelic experience. But that same thing, the shadow side of that could be the sort of like intolerance, where you're like, if the people who are, if you can't be included into my utopian vision of happiness, then you're the outcast or whatever. Or we have to basically, with Saturn would be more of like the exile. Like Saturn's like, we're gonna put you in prison, we're gonna put you in jail, we're gonna exile you. Neptune's we're just gonna dissolve you. We're gonna put you in the acid vat, and you're gonna be like melted into goo, or with Neptune. It's kind of grisly, but that's the best image I can think of right now. So there's, and I think that's the risk too with Mercury trine Neptune, is that, Mercury deals with differentiations, with making choices between this or that, with making negotiations and deals, and that Neptune could just sort of blur and dissolve things, so it's kind of fuzzy and you're not thinking clearly, or that you're being prone to deception. I think the whole thing about con artists and people who are trying to like do one over on you, and that's like, I mean, that's one thing that I am kind of wary of when it comes to the whole new age scene, because it's, you got to be careful, because I think I've always had the sense going into the whole esoteric new age stuff that I had to use discernment. I had to take things with a grain of salt, right? Like if you're gonna read something about astrology, if you're just getting into this for the first time and you're new to it, that like, you don't buy everything hook, line, and sinker. Basically, you have to exercise your judgment to is this what's real, what isn't, what's a reliable source of information, what's not. And when you're dealing with the Neptune spirituality, there's stuff like dealing with like cults and gurus, and what's a scam, who's the charlatan, who's real. This is all stuff that could come out of the whole Neptune Mercury dynamic. And I don't know. I generally, the thing is, I mostly have had pretty positive experiences with this kind of stuff. I'm not the kind of person who goes around warning people like, watch out, don't get into, you know, spirituality because people are out to get your money and rip you off or sleep with you or or all that kind of thing. But that is, I think, with Neptune dynamics, that's kind of what you have to look out for, because there could be things that are like posing as being either innocent or pure or, you know, boundary dissolving spiritual, but it's really, you know, where that dynamic between what's pure and what's toxic, right? Or the sinner and the saint, right? That, which is often a dynamic that you really see come into spirituality, right? Whereas people who are posing as being the most pure and the most saintly can often be the most corrupt. So you got to watch out for all that stuff. The thing about, anyways, the thing about Frodo, I think, is the basic lesson, I think, with all the Neptune transits is keep your nose clean. As us Canadians would say, keep your stick on the ice, which is basically, you know, like, there's like the Christian thing, right? With like, who's without sin cast the first stone, or, you know, before you go to take whatever it is, was that when if there's something in your neighbor's eye, before you know, check your own, rather than pointing out the flaw in somebody else, kind of thing. And I think that's the best sort of thing that I've heard, anyways. Again, I'm indebted to my friend for kind of pointing this out, but you have to make sure that you are. It's better to make sure that you're doing things right than to go around criticizing everybody else, basically, and pointing out all the toxic, you know, like projecting it like this person's toxic and this person's negative and this is a bad influence. Like, it's better to like clean up your own business and see where you can do better with that, and so that you're not, because if you don't, it's like, it's basically just going to come right back at you. Like, if you are being hypocritical for blaming someone for something that you have the exact same problem with, it's just gonna come right back in your face, basically. And like, like, don't dish it out unless you can take it, kind of thing. And like, be careful what it is you're, you know, or if you are dishing it out, you know, make it constructive, or that, like, and if it comes back, then welcome it, you know, to welcome it as constructive criticism rather than, you know, just being vile and harmful against people or whatever. That's the best thing I can say, anyways. So this is hopefully I did a good job here, and you get some, you learned something from my little Neptune video. Hopefully my speaking's okay and everything like that. Okay.